Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Not Another Whiskey podcast. I am your co-host, Nicholas Polacki, joined today, of course, by my beautiful co-host, Mr. Mitch Bouchard. Mitch, how are you doing, mate?
Beautiful now. How am I beautiful now, mate? That's kind of weird.
I've been drinking heavily.
Okay, get it.
There we go. We have a
I'm not going to argue with you, though.
Well, take what you can get, Mitch. To be fair, we have a wonderful guest today, a man who I fantastically and very fortuitously bumped into in Chicago just a couple of weeks ago as we were out at something called Discus. And I ended up in this kind of little room where they were kind of being showcased around all these wonderful spirits, bit of rum, lots of whiskies from Australia. And I bumped into the wonderful Mr. David Vitale, who's joining us here today. Dave, thanks very much for being a guest.
Hi, g'day Mitch, g'day Nick, how are you?
G'day indeed.
Yeah.
Is this you leaning heavily into this too? Because Dave, you live in the States now, is that correct?
I do. I've turned into a bit of I need to enunciate my R's. So I think just talk like a pirate and that helps everybody understand what I'm saying, you know.
I think that's just good advice for life, just to walk around talking like a pirate.
Exactly.
I think you're the only person right now, Dave, that's working on this day. Because as we record this, it's the 4th of July, obviously. So being an Aussie, you don't give a shit, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's a very, the first year that I was in the United States, I actually went to Canada on the 4th of July, which was almost enough to revoke my visa, I think.
So, Dave, I want to get into these whiskies here because you kindly sent me samples. Nicholas, have you got yours yet?
I have.
Yes.
Eventually, first time ever.
Wait, this is the first ever podcast. Yeah. Unbelievable. Well, we both got samples. We're actually doing a double take on this. So we tried to do this recording last week, but we had some tech issues. But the night before that, so it was a week yesterday, I got into your samples a little bit, believe it or not, with some Aussies that were in my house. And they were actually from Melbourne, which I know where your wonderful distillery is from as well.
Were they captives or were they guests?
Well, yeah. I kind of kept them locked into the whiskey snug. But I want to get into your story first. Like, what inspired you to embark on this journey creating Starward? Because I know whiskey wasn't your background initially. So can you share the story behind that decision?
Yeah, actually, my first love when it comes to alcoholic beverages is beer. Like we were just talking about that. So I'm a very, very, very frustrated home brewer at the moment because like every ounce, every liter of beer that we make, we turn into whiskey. But yeah, that was my first love. I grew up in an Italian household, and so, you know, obviously growing up, we didn't see a lot of whiskey. We saw a lot of wine, right? That's what everyone drank around the dinner table. It was certainly what my uncles tried to make and didn't do too great a job of. And so that was the childhood. Like beverage was, you know, at the dinner table was wine. And then, you know, whiskey was very revered. It was what we gave our accountant for Christmas, you know, and it was also what my Greek friends' dads drank when they were playing poker. That's all I knew of whiskey. It was something very special and something that, you know, was for definitely old men, right? And so I thought that might be part of my drinking journey at some point, but it's going to be a lot later on. So I loved making craft beer. And the thing I love about craft beer is that, you know, when you start to dive into that world, there's, well, the beer shop that I used to go to had like 40 yeasts on the shelf, and you had another, you know, 7 or 8 grains that you could purchase, and it's probably increased now. You know, both of those have probably increased now. And so when you factor all of that out, there was hundreds of different types of beers that you could make. And I thought that was a lot of fun and exciting because you could explore flavor. And then given that, you know, I was a bit of loved cooking at home, and I thought, well, this is going to be fun. Like I can kind of take all of that idea of how we craft food and combine flavors into the beer world. I was in tech at the time. I owned my own e-learning business. This is late 90s, early noughties. So real bleeding edge of e-learning.
Yep.
And sold that business in 2005. And the gag during the pandemic was that, like, yeah, I just didn't see any future in e-learning. So I gave that business away. And thought, that's it. I've sold the business. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I'm going to set up a craft brewery. And at that point in time, there may have been 10 or so craft breweries in Australia. And when I mean craft, very, very small. Like the biggest of them would have been like Mountain Goat in Melbourne, which is now owned by Asahi. But
Don't know them. Never heard of them.
yeah,
It's a little startup company, is it?
Yeah, startup from Japan. But it was very, very small, nascent industry, like the 1980s of American craft beer, right? And I thought, this is going to be great. I can get in at the ground level and start to think about beer for drinkers like me that were interested in flavor, and got really excited by that. I happened to fall in love at the same time, and we moved to Tasmania. And so the idea was, like, we're going to set up an organic Tasmanian microbrewery. That was the big vision. There's one small problem with that, and that's that good beer doesn't travel well. If I did want to kind of take something to the world and have something that was really exciting from Australia, that sort of represented the best that we could possibly do, then organic craft beer from Tasmania is the worst possible idea, just in terms of, I mean, getting it to the mainland is a task enough, let alone the rest of the world. And so I shelved that idea, but very quickly discovered the Lark Distillery, which was one of the first, if not the first, licensed distillery in Tasmania, after 150 years of like no licensed spirits distilleries in Tasmania. And I walked into this little cafe, waterfront cafe and distillery, it said on the front. So I just kind of thought distilleries were for perfumes. I didn't know what it was, but as soon as I walked in there was a copper pot still just in the doorway. There's barrels of whiskey aging. And as you kind of walked through this cafe of, tables and chairs, the bar and the counter where you ordered your coffees had about 150 single malts on the back bar. And my mind was blown.
Wow.
Because this was 2004, I'm going to say. And
it's pretty progressive for 2004.
Exactly. Like, I mean, today a back bar with an establishment with 150 single malts is not, far-fetched. But back then that was something to behold. And I had no idea. Like I said, it was Johnny Walker's and Chivas Regal was like my world of reference point. And so all of a sudden I looked at these single malts and realized that these were the craft beers of the whiskey world. That was the beginning of the end for me. Like, like it was just, this is going to be the rest of my life for sure.
That's super cool. We've seen a massive rise in popularity of Australian whiskies in recent years. What factors do you think have attributed to this kind of increased recognition, and how have you seen it kind of impact your growth and like your reach?
Yeah, look, I think there was a pivotal moment in the history of Australian whiskey in 2014, and that was when Sullivan's Cove from Tasmania won world's best single malt. Not just the best of the rest of the world, it was up against Scotch whiskey and anywhere else that was making single malt whiskey at the time. It was a pretty exciting moment because we had just launched about 9 months beforehand. If I had a chart of my sales and just showed you the chart and I'd said to you, guess when Sullivan's Cove won the award, it'd be blindingly obvious when that was, for two reasons. The first is that a rising tide lifts all boats. So we leveraged off that, maybe Australia does make great whiskey. But the second was, my harebrained idea was to make as much whiskey as I possibly could and begged, borrowed, and stole to do that. Or maybe not stole, but almost, to do that, And so when the award came out, the only whiskey that was on the shelf after all of the Tasmanian craft whiskies were gone was Starward. And that's been a hallmark of the reasons why I started the distillery was to be always available, a really consistent whiskey that was perhaps people's entry point into Australian whiskey and maybe even whiskey period, like altogether. That was the ambition. And we're going to do that by being a modern alternative to the traditional Scotch whiskeys that were available, and a modern version of like that very tried and true method of like American sort of nostalgia that bourbons at that point in time had really leaned into. So we wanted to be an Australian whiskey that talked to the place it's made, and that was the turning point for Starward. And so I think that awards make a big difference. Awards make a huge difference to people's awareness of the product.
Yep.
The funny thing is that we've tried to make a really consistent whiskey for the last, since we started 15 years ago. It was always for me like a consistent whiskey is the way that we're going to kind of win hearts and minds. And so we've like last year and this year have won 12 double gold medals from the San Francisco World Spirits competition, back to back. 12 last year and 12 this year. And then, last year that got us Distillery of the Year, which is a huge accolade for a fledgling distillery from Melbourne. We're the youngest distillery in the history of the competition to win that award.
Wow.
But funnily enough, we haven't changed anything about the way we make whiskey, and so I think it's been just a recognition of like a different style of whiskey. And when you kind of think of whiskey, from certain parameters of like, is it well crafted? Is it distinctive? Does it kind of relate to my palate the way other whiskeys do, but in a way that's like uniquely their own? And once you kind of look at it from those kind of hallmarks, Starward definitely stands out. So I think for a lot of those early years, we didn't even get medals, which are almost like participation awards. If you're getting like a bronze or like just a medal, like you get a medal.
You showed up to the race.
It's like over in America, mate. All the kids do all this stuff and they just get a medal for like whatever they want to do.
Everyone gets a trophy.
Some years we didn't even get a medal, and that was just, I think people were like, "What is this?"
Yep.
Right. And now we're getting recognized as like some of the world's best.
That's fantastic. So good. And it's so interesting you say that. I mean, I remember almost the same thing happened with Japanese whiskey, right? 2008 World Whiskey Awards. It was blended and single malt Japanese whiskey that won best in the world. And everyone in Scotland went, wait a minute, they're not meant to be doing that. That's meant to be our awards over there. Yeah. But I want to bring it back to Australian whiskey here, because you already mentioned Lark whiskey earlier on. And, Bill Lark is kind of considered one of the sort of grandfathers, if you like, of Australian whiskey, I think. Did you go to him at all and say, hey, Bill, we're going to start this distillery. Have you got any advice to us? Or was that something that came later on?
Oh, Mitch, I did one better. I convinced him to give me a job. So it was at the Lark distillery that this happened. And I had all of this good beer doesn't travel well sort of mindset of like, I want to take something to the world. This is amazing. Why doesn't anyone know about what's going on in this small corner of the world? It's bloody delicious. At that point in time, I was introduced to the Balvenie Double Wood, which was my gateway single malt. And I thought, well, anything that I'm drinking from Tasmania is equally as good as this. I worked with Bill and Lynn Lark for 3 years, learning how to make whiskey, how to sell it, what it was, what the conversation was. And the inspiring thing about Bill, he's a traditionalist, anti-establishment person. It's kind of a bit of an enigma, right? In terms of loves the history of Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey, loves it. Like just, in his mind, it's like, I want to make whiskey the way it used to be made, and all those sorts of nostalgic kind of touch points. But then it was like, I'm going to stick it to the man at the same time. But the man wasn't Scotch, which I thought was kind of interesting and really wise in a way, because he was pioneering a new category.
Yep.
Globally. And if you didn't have the goodwill of the Scotch whiskey industry to support you, then you're in trouble. I think it was Lark's website. It was definitely one of the Tasmanian whiskey websites early on. We make Tasmanian whiskey in the finest of Scottish traditions. And I kind of like provoked the teams to say, I think we're okay with whiskey made in the finest of Scottish traditions. Like there's plenty of those on that back bar. What about Australian whiskey? You know, what sets us apart? How do we kind of convince a drinker to have a fourth whiskey? At that point in time, it was, you know, to your point, Mitch, like just basically Scotch, Irish, bourbon, American, if we kind of put bourbon and rye together. And I was like, we can be a fourth pillar, you know, of whiskey, and it can be Australian whiskey. But if it's the same as Scotch whiskey, then why are people going to put it on their bar cart at home?
Yep.
And so,
And I love that, because that was going to be the next. I wanted to bring it back to Starward here and one of these incredible samples that you sent us, because you know, when these 4 bottles arrived, which I was really surprised at, I'm like, wow, you guys sent 4 bottles. That's amazing. Thank you very much.
I only get 2.
But you only got 1. What are you talking about?
That would have been perfect.
I was like, just send Nicholas one.
Nick gets everything. He gets everything. It's insane. Yeah. Go ahead, Mitch.
But you know what? It's interesting, Dave, because you're chatting about, you know, how you didn't want to adhere, almost like do the Scotch whiskey thing, right? And the first bottle that popped out in the samples, and I know you guys, you know, experiment with a lot, and I think innovation seems to be integral with Starward, right? The first one that I cracked open was this ginger beer cask, because I'm like, I need to see what the fuck is going on here, and this blew my mind, man. Can you talk a little bit about this? And I saw you guys had a stout cask coming out just recently as well. It's like in the next couple of weeks or so.
You're absolutely right. Like if anybody's familiar with the Australian whiskey regulations, it's literally one line of regulations. That's all we need to adhere to. And it's the basics. It's a fermented grain mash that's distilled. Doesn't tell you what type of still it is. Doesn't tell you which grains you can and can't use. It just needs to be a grain. Doesn't have any kind of stipulations on the type of yeast or which ones you can or can't use. No cut points on the distillation, which, you know, or the technology that you're using. It can be a column or pot that's distilled and aged in wood for a minimum of 2 years. So it doesn't even stipulate an oak or a used barrel or a new barrel or char levels or anything like that. And then just has that age gate of a minimum of 2 to kind of qualify for quality, I guess, in their minds back in the day. Yep. This regulation goes back to, it's the second piece of legislation that was implemented after Federation.
That was the second thing?
Yeah.
Whiskey?
Yeah.
So priorities.
Taxes and then whiskey. Because where are they getting the taxes from?
Correct. But I actually like this. And I actually think this is where innovation can champion, because when people talk about tradition, what they're really talking about is innovation plus time. It's not the traditions of today is something that somebody did 30 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. Like Japanese whiskey is a great example. You know,
you're absolutely right, Nicholas. And that was kind of our mindset, is like, let's make our own new traditions with this regulation that's so broad you can shoot a cannon through it. You know what I mean? Like, why would we tie ourselves down to this narrow, specific definition of whiskey that's so well done, by the way, right? Yep. It's already well done. Like, what are we bringing to the conversation? And so that was kind of my provocation. And so by the time, it was really clear to me that after a few years in Tasmania, it was time to go back home to Melbourne, which is where I grew up. For a few reasons. I had a young family, and, you know, family support's helpful. But more importantly, I think what we realized, both Bill, Lynn, and myself, was that my ambition for Lark was way bigger than their ambition for Lark at that point in time. But it wasn't because it was necessarily the wrong thing to do, but just not with their retirement savings.
Fair enough.
And so, you know, I remember going into, it was April 2007. I remember going into this board meeting sort of with my like mindset of like, either you're with me or you're against me kind of mindset. And it was kind of amusing, because I think Bill actually said, like, Dave, we've been waiting for you to come to this conclusion for the last 6 months, you know. Of course, go, you know, and set up the distillery that you think is the right thing for you to do, and there's plenty of space for everybody to thrive and grow. So with their blessing, you know, we started Starward in 2007 and haven't looked back. But, you know, you're totally right, that idea of like, what's going to be the tradition of Australia in 30 years' time? Now, I don't necessarily think, Mitch, it's going to be ginger beer cask aged whiskey. That's going to be a Starward tradition, and it already is. Like we never make enough of that. Every year, we've kind of doubled production, and we can never keep up. Like during the pandemic, obviously a little bit more bored for time. I did the math, and I think in 2020, you had more chance of getting into Harvard than you did one of these bottles statistically, because we set up a ballot, like a lottery, to give away the bottles. Such is the demand for it. So it's definitely struck a chord with drinkers, and it struck a chord for the very reason that we've all been talking about: innovation. It's bloody delicious. It's a lot of fun, and it's something that would be really difficult to pull off in Scotland, illegal to make in, as a bourbon in the United States. And so we kind of found something that was distinctly us. If back in the day, we didn't have these premium mixes that were really well balanced and exquisitely crafted products. It was either Schweppes or, a local, black and orange labeled product made for the supermarket. That's all you had as mixes. I was frustrated. I said to the team, why can't we just make a perfectly balanced ginger beer for our whiskey? And this was Solera back at the time, which is our Apera aged whiskey, which is basically Apera's Australian sherry. But don't give it to a Spaniard and call it sherry. They'll probably shank you. Like very, very different sherry to Apera. So the team basically went off. I said, make me a ginger beer that's perfectly matched to Starward. And if you tell a brewer to make a beer, guess what? It's going to be fermented and it's going to be alcoholic. And they fermented the ginger beer in one of our old barrels. And so the mindset at the first instance, well, it's going to have a bit more depth of character because it's extracting some of those oak tannins into the ginger beer, and maybe a bit of booze. And by the end of fermentation, it was like 11.5% ginger beer because it also extracted a lot of the booze, or a lot of the whiskey in the oak. I give you the tip: one of those in the afternoon, and you're ready for a nap.
Lie down in a dark room, right?
Yeah. And then back to work. So we drank the ginger beer, and then it was like, well, what are we going to do with this barrel now that it's been tainted in our minds with all this ginger? And it wasn't my idea. I can't take credit for this. It was Hugh Holtz, one of our original distillers, who now works as a consultant in the distilling industry in South Australia. He said, why don't we just fill some of our Solera vat into the barrel and see what happens? Said, sure, let's do it. And so we did that. And then 9 months later, the first version of Ginger Beer Cask was released. I think there was like 43 bottles of it, which is just enough for staffies, really, between the staff members and the bar, we had a tiki bar at the distillery. And people that drank it loved it and said, you need to make more of this. And so we did. We made a 200-litre barrel, and off we went. And I think, none of us could have, this is the nature of innovation sometimes, right? Like it came from a need internally to just have better mixes, right? So we were after the ginger beer, and then the ginger beer cask was the product that actually ended up being the whiskey. Ginger beer cask finished whiskey was the thing that, we have made 8 versions of now. The funny thing is that, at some point in the middle there, we were like, what are we doing with, we were making way more ginger beer than anyone could possibly drink at a distillery. And so we actually worked with a local brewery, and they sold their alcoholic ginger beer that was aged in Starward barrels, and we got the barrels that were for our ginger beer. And now we use the ginger beer for our RTDs. So all of the Starward and ginger that people are drinking makes the ginger beer casks for that particular release.
Very cool.
I was going to say, you have to do an RTD. You guys love an RTD in Australia, though, don't you?
We'll put anything in a can, right? Like it's our DNA.
Well, and I was just going to say, the chances of Mitch getting into Harvard versus getting a bottle of this whiskey, much more highly likely he will get a bottle of this whiskey. I think your odds were slightly off there, right, Mitch?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
100%, I think 100%.
I know you've got a 4.0 average, but I think that's your blood alcohol level, not your grade score.
Very good.
Very all right there, courtesy of Ricky Crawford, that joke. So there you go. Anywho, one of the things, Dave, that we were looking at was like obviously specifically speaking about Nova, because I think Nova is hands down one of the most exciting whiskies I've personally drank. Like it was the one whiskey that you and I sat and you handed me a glass of it in Chicago, and it's the first time I tasted it. It's won a ton of awards and accolades and global recognition. This obviously international acclaim and the approach to your production, like you've now expanded out, you've got a global presence, you're collaborating and you're taking your own investment and working with your partner Diageo. Like, what is your vision for what this brand is capable of doing? Because I can honestly say it's inspiring from my standpoint with where we are with our brand with Shibui. What you're doing right now is exactly how I think about how we look at whiskies, and the rules and regulations around Australian whiskies is exactly how I think that the world whiskey category should expand and explore. Like, what do you see the vision of Starward being?
Look, the first line of the business plan. So this is after that chance meeting at the whiskey bar at Lark Distillery in 2005. I kind of went home and then started to think about whiskey. I couldn't stop thinking about whiskey. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And then I thought, this is going to be it. This is what I'm going to do instead of the beer. It was a one-line mission, right? To offer the world a distinctly Australian whiskey with pride. That's it, right? Everything that we do kind of comes back to that one mission, and it's still the same today as it was back then, which is, for any budding entrepreneur, like if you can nail your ambition and just kind of be true to that every day, and then find people crazy enough to jump on that journey with you before it's rational, right? Then you're onto something.
Yep.
And so everything that we do kind of comes back to that sort of mission, like to offer the world. So it's always this idea of something that we could take to the world, a global whiskey that's going to sit on a drinks cart at home next to a Scotch, a bourbon, an Irish, a Japanese whiskey. The world, a distinctly Australian whiskey, right? So from day one, it was like, we can't out Lafroig. I don't have the chops to kind of turn up to a meeting with Jim McEwen and Mr. Patterson and say, yeah, we make Australian whiskey better than the Scots do, in the finest of Scottish traditions. Like I just couldn't possibly think of saying that, right?
Yep.
But I could say we make Australian whiskey better than you can make Australian whiskey,
Yep.
And here's why. We'll talk about that in a sec. So this distinctly Australian whiskey was really important, and that's born of the place it's made, like great whiskeys are: the ingredients, the climate, and the culture, with pride. That's the bit that's sort of like, okay, let's just make sure this is a well-crafted product that has the potential to put us on the map, and they were the touch points. The next thing after that was, what are my inspirations? What are my inspirations to making whiskey? If I really want to kind of do this and be distinctly Australian and be relevant to global whiskey drinkers, some of which don't know they like whiskey yet, by the way, like me at that point in time, how are we going to do this? And I kind of thought, I need to have some touch points in whiskey making. And the 5 whiskeys that inspired Starward were Johnnie Walker Black, Maker's Mark, Balvenie Doublewood, Lafroig 10, or any Lafroig, and Wild Turkey 101. And I'm not talking like inspiration from a flavor perspective, because if you married those together, that would be the pure definition of a whiskey Frankenstein, right? Like, it's not that. It was more from, well, Johnnie Walker Black has had 6 blenders in its 200-year history, and you can thread a needle through it. That's how consistent it's been over the years, right? It's changed, obviously, but the hallmarks of what makes Johnnie Walker are still the same. Maker's Mark is nailed, like accessibility and approachability in bourbon, right? It's high wheat content whiskey. It also was talking about premium before premium was a thing. Balvenie Doublewood, It's just delicious and exceptionally, they talk about their craft being so important to how they make the whiskey. And it was my gateway single malt. So how could it not be part of the story? Lefroy 10, when you pop the cork on a Lefroy bottle of Lefroy or Ardbeg for that matter, or Lagavulin or any of the peated whiskies, that you're drinking peated whiskies. And so when I talk about a distinctly Australian whiskey, that's the benchmark, that like you put it to your nose and say, this is remarkable for all the good reasons and very different to anything that I've had before. It's very distinctive, like Lefroy. And maybe one day we could be as iconic as Wild Turkey 101. They were the inspirations for Starward. And so Nova and Twofold, they're core products that are aged in red wine barrels, and Left Field in the the UK and Europe, all have that sort of, that's the framework with which we kind of have started thinking about crafting these whiskies, aging in red wine barrels, which at the time was, everybody thought we were crazy for a few reasons. And don't get me wrong, there were kind of like heart in my mouth moments along the way. Like it wasn't looking all that great. The Starward has a tendency during its teen months to kind of be very teenager-like, unpredictable, not obedient, sort of take its own path. It doesn't.
And why is that? Is that something to do with your new make spirit, or is that the climate?
No, it's actually, the new make's beautiful. Like the new make's that modern era of new make production, which is more like a barley schnapps than it is like traditional Scotch malt whiskey new make spirit that needs time in wood to become what it becomes, right? And that's a product of fermentation, it's a product of distillation, it's a product of the barley that we're using that makes that really delicious new make spirit. It's actually the oak. You got to remember that, like when we're working with red wine barrels, but a red wine barrel doesn't have any char, right? It's not a charred American oak barrel or charred French oak barrel. And char in whiskey is really important because it's caramelizing tannins and lignans in the oak and turning them into delicious flavors, and also creating a carbon filter to filter out a lot of those nastier compounds in spirits. Now, we weren't doing that, so it was a big bet. And it wasn't the new make that was the problem. We didn't need the char. In fact, we charred a lot of our early barrels with Solera, and it would be like 9 months later in Melbourne's environment, it was like, where did our spirit go? Because we worked so hard to make this delicious spirit that it was completely cleaned up in the oak. It was more to do with the fact that we're engaging with maybe toasted oak, right? That's the level of interaction of heat in the wood. And so between the wine character and the oak character, it just goes through a bit of an unbalanced phase of like, like it's just not an integrated whiskey. And it just needs one more summer in Australia, and then it just turns into this beautiful liquid that we all know and love. But red wine barrels is the key, because obviously we drink a bit of wine in Australia. We make a bit of wine. We make way more than we drink. And so we had this abundance of flavor influencer right on our doorstep. And we were able to get these wine barrels from the winery to the distillery very quickly, overnight usually. Wine goes out and whiskey goes in. And so all of a sudden, that conversation that the spirit's having with the wine is really influenced not only by the fruit, whether it's Shiraz, Cabernet, or Pinot, but also the wood policy of the winemaker. Like, we've got Shiraz producers that are using French oak barrels. Obviously, a lot of them are using American oak barrels. Some of them are medium toasts, or like, we actually do char some of our barrels just to give it a bit more flavor. There's different forests, both in France and America, that winemakers are choosing to select the oak from to craft their particular wine. And that has an influence. It's been at the winery for a few vintages or one vintage. That's going to have an impact on flavor. So when you factor out like this family tree of barrels that we have access to, there's about 140 different types of barrels that we use to craft Nova and Twofold and Left Field, and Left Field is 100% French oak. So they're instantly, that's 72 of the 144, because we're not looking at the American side of the family, which is a bit more bombastic and loud and like, in your face, American oak and Americans, compared to the French oak, which is a bit more nuanced and delicate and soft. So we've got these, I call them, if we're thinking of like a painting a picture, when, in the American context, you just got one, you're working with charcoal, quite literally, right? It's one color, you're making a charcoal drawing. Now you can gradate and have like, use your hand, right, to have a darker elements of charcoal on the page to craft this beautiful picture, or lighter shading, but it's still either black or white. Whereas we're using 140 different colors to get a higher resolution picture, which helps with consistency, and it also helps with that distinctive flavor profile.
We did some stuff on Australian whiskey. We had Craig Johnson from Lark, who you probably know, good Scottish guy. I think he's coming over to Macallan now. And when we were chatting to him, he said you guys have got, I think it was over 300 distilleries, not just making whiskey, obviously, but it's kind of moved into that kind of craziness now. So, double-barreled question for you on that. Are you guys all like playing happily families over there? Are you all helping each other out? And the other question that I wanted to ask you as well, there's a big part of what we talk about on the show with regards to sustainability. We've done whole episodes on it. We've talked about what's going on in Scotland. Is there something being put in place in Australia, and specifically with what you do at Starward with regards to your production, your sustainability program?
Yes, great questions. So the first is, as Nicholas mentioned, we had an Australia room at a conference. It's a distilled spirits conference in Chicago. And so, following on the footsteps of the way that Bill sort of thought, look, a rising tide lifts all boats. I need to be an inclusive kind of founding father of this whiskey movement, and really craft spirits movement. We've carried on that tradition. So there were no bar fights. We all played happy campers. Look, and I feel it today. Like, just recently, Morris Distillery, which is up in northern Victoria, just launched in the United States. And I think the Gospel Whiskey, which is another Victorian distillery, has just launched in America as well. So there's 3 whiskeys out of the, I think, 150 now whiskey distilleries that are in production at the very least. So about half of those are on the shelf. Three of them. Now, a category 1 doesn't work, particularly in the United States, where there's 60 feet of bourbon before you get to the 5 feet of whiskeys not from here, So I welcome and support the industry, as much as I possibly can, because I think that the more people learn about Australian whiskey, the better. With that broad regulation that we've got, it's, I think, the most exciting whiskey category in the world, because it's just not pinned down by anything, number one. Number two, Western Australian barley is very, very different to Victorian barley, which is very different to Tasmanian barley. And so, and South Australians in the middle there, right? Like, so we grow malted barley for brewing across the country. And of course, it's going to have a different flavor profile, even if it's the same genetic makeup, which usually they're not. So the strains are different. That's going to make a difference in terms of flavor, but also the terroir is different. So that's going to make a huge difference just in terms of the sun. Forget about the ground. The amount of sun that these grains get is going to be different in different parts of Australia. And then obviously the climate's different. So when you factor all of those sorts of things into production, you end up with Starward making a double grain whiskey, wheat and single malt, aged in red wine barrels. And then we've got a single malt whiskey aged in red wine barrels. You've got a guy up the road, 10 kilometers up the road, making amazing malted rye whiskey in a big column still. It's bloody delicious. And I take the keys to his distillery. Then you go down south into Tassie, and there's 30 odd single malt whiskey distilleries down there that are doing great things. And so it's a very, very, very exciting industry that I just think we're at the beginning of seeing more of around the world. And I can't wait. I really, really can't wait.
That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, mate. It's exciting times, right? for world blends. So do you think you'll always do Australian distilled spirit? Do you think you'd ever venture into the world of world blending and some of the stuff that we're seeing in Japan and in the States and some stuff even in Scotland now?
It's a good question. Like we were actually talking about this as a group. I think Japan's kind of cornered the market in world blending. They've been doing it for a few years now, haven't they? So, like,
100 years.
they're
celebrating the 100-year anniversary of malt whiskey with nowhere to blend it. So yeah, 100 years of blending.
So Japan's kind of cornered the market there, and I think they're doing a great job of it. I think there's some exciting opportunities there. It's not our story to tell, but I think that certainly from an aging point of view, I think Starward has some of the hardest working barrels in the world. Just in terms of that. Obviously, we're influenced by the outback and the weather coming in from the north into Melbourne, that hot, dry wind. And we also got another desert to our south called Antarctica, right? So that has a huge impact as well. So that huge diurnal range would impact any spirit, regardless of where it's made and what grains it's using.
Is my mic gone again?
No, you're up. You're live.
Oh, good. Okay.
Thanks
right,
for
David.
Giving me something to edit, though. Jesus Christ, Mitch.
Makes a change to for me having to do it, pal.
Well, the one thing I wish I could edit is that shirt you're wearing. Holy hell, man. Dressed in the dark again. Dressed in the dark. I'm only joking. It's lovely. Do they do menswear?
Are you finished? Are you finished? Can we get on with the show and stop talking about my fashion?
Sorry, Dave, just give us a minute here. We're just trying to get through some stuff.
Dave, give me a minute while I virtually punch fuck out of him.
All right, we'll cut that.
Yeah. Oh, I might keep it. Quite nice. Right, Dave, I want to get into some quick fire questions with you, if you're cool with that, just to finish off the show. So, kind of something fun that we like to do. Nicholas, you want to kick off with the first one?
Sure, no problem at all. We did chat a little bit about beer earlier, but are you a pot, schooner, or a pint kind of guy? And what's your favourite Aussie beer right now?
Ooh, pint.
Pint of?
Yeah, Guinness.
There you go. That's
Guinness.
not beer. But that was a good Irish answer.
Yeah.
You're not a 4X fan, mate?
I'll take a hard on 4X. Being a Melbourne born and bred, I'm a VB kind of after freezing cold VB after mowing the lawn on a 38-degree day kind of guy.
I agree.
Man, I liked a wee VB when I was over there. Kind of salty.
Well.
Yeah. All right. In the unlikely event that your whiskey could speak, what iconic Australian phrase or slang would it use to describe itself?
Oh, geez, that's hard. What iconic Australian slang would it use to identify itself? It'd be "How's it going, mate?" for sure. It's supposed to be approachable, easy drinking, sociable whiskey, right?
Not like Ripper. All right. Who's your favorite Neighbours character?
I'm gonna date myself here. Charlene.
Yeah, she was killer.
Has to be Charlene.
Had to be. I like Madge as well. She was Charlene's mum.
You were Jason Donovan, weren't you, Nicholas?
Caroline and Christina, mate. Caroline and Christina, the twins. Actually, so I will interject just at this point in the quick fire line. We'll do a quick. I actually went to the set. So I have a strange uncle who's a great uncle that's sadly passed, a guy called Father Bob Maguire. Dave, I don't know if this name rings a bell to you or not. Do you know this guy?
Yes.
Yeah, so he did a. He was my mum's uncle. Yeah, so he's my great uncle was Father Bob Maguire.
Yeah.
So he was a bit of a cool dude. Like he was part of the church, but was a bit of a renegade. Talk about renegades, and he did a ton of stuff. They tried to kick him out. Like they wanted him out of the church, and he was like, no danger. Because he did so much stuff for homelessness, and like I think he was like won a ton of awards and highest things for stuff that he did in the community. But he was a bit of a rock star, and he got me in at the age of, I think it was 8 years old. I got onto the set. I visited Australia, did 7 weeks in Oz, and I got onto the set of Neighbours and stood in like Charlene's in Madge's kitchen and got to meet Caroline and Christina. I've got an old photograph I'll send you.
Oh wow.
Right between the twins. Oh, I lit up like a Christmas tree, so I did.
I'm sure
Okay, it wouldn't be a podcast episode without Nicholas's celebrity story, would it?
There's always one. But this one
Always
was
one.
more about my celebrity great uncle who was a very good man. Sadly passed away very recently, but yeah, very, very cool dude. Anyway, so
Right, Dave,
right, Mitch.
have you, serious question for you, have you ever caught a whiff of Vegemite in your warehouse and thought, maybe we're onto something here, we could get this in a bit of Starward?
I love Vegemite. I was a late convert to Vegemite, and the reason why was
Is this awful?
No. I don't think my mum quite understood. She kind of spread it on as if it was Nutella onto sandwiches. Way too much. Way too
It's got to
much.
be thin. It's got to be a thin layer.
On top of slatherings of butter, and now more modern kind of like hipsters then put some avocado on top, right? So like it's the improved avocado toast is with some Vegemite underneath it. So like I think that umami punch would be really interesting actually with some red wine characteristics.
No shackles for you guys. You could do it. You could do it.
I'm up for it because it's just you've got my brain thinking then too, stuffed artichokes is an Italian delicacy. Parmesan cheese, breadcrumbs in the leaves, and you kind of like eat them, and then anything you eat after that always tastes delicious, right?
Correct.
The chinnarin in the artichoke. That's why chinna is so great.
So there you go, everyone. When you taste your first Vegemite Starward, you heard it here first on the show. You can either thank us or hate us for it.
Yeah, it'll be great. It'll be great.
If you could do one thing in Australia, money and time is not an issue, what would you do?
Oh, geez. Set up a microbrewery.
There you go.
Like I wanted to 15 years ago.
Nice. Right. So Ardbeg recently jumped on the barbecue theme with an expression of their whiskey. Any plans for throw another shrimp on the Barbie Starward?
Are you in our NPD meetings? What's going on? We've got a mole we've got to fish out.
Can you elaborate on that, or will we say no more?
We did do like a hickory smoked whiskey, which was bloody delicious. The challenge is, if we're being serious, the challenge is finding a maltster that'll be up for kind of going down that path. And certainly 15 years ago, like if I went to a maltster and said, hey, I need 300 kilos of your best single malt, can you smoke it for me too? 2-word answer, 1 syllable each, you can figure it out, right? Like particularly Australian accent. This is not going to happen. But today, the great news is that there are a lot of maltsters that are really keen to start thinking about like heirloom grains, which is fantastic.
Yep.
And also peat smoking, which is awesome. So
That's
I think
cool.
that the future looks really interesting for that level of innovation coming from the grain, which early on was just too hard for us to kind of contemplate.
Hey, Dave, well, the last few questions that we've got for you are in the form of would you rather. And I will preface this with Mitch writes these, so expect them to be mental and crazy, but at least it limits you to at least only one of 2 options. So would you rather have a pet kangaroo that constantly challenges you to a boxing match, or a pet koala that falls asleep and clings to your head at the most inconvenient times?
Kangaroo.
Would you rather wear flip-flops or thongs, as you guys say, on your hands for the rest of your life, or you must speak only in Australian slang no matter where you are in the world?
I would the latter, just for that. I mean, that would be so much fun, but I don't think I can pull it off. I've extricated myself from Australia for too long now to kind of.
You turn into Alf from Home and Away, right? Would you rather ride a kangaroo to work every day, complete with a custom kangaroo saddle, or have a pet wombat that helps you with all your household chores?
Wombat.
Yep.
Fair play. Love the floor, like I've got grubby kids, and they just kind of like it'd be like a Roomba, but a life like Roomba.
I mean, both of those would be pretty fucking cool, though. You have to admit.
It'd be a Woomba.
Oh, yeah. Right, so
Copyright
David,
here.
David, that's our stupid questions out of the way. You'll be glad to hear. But tell us about, like, on a serious note, if people are looking to find out about Starward, where can they go? Social media handles, website, do the plug.
Yeah, so obviously on all the socials we're Starward Whiskey. Um, keep in touch. Subscribe on our newsletter at starward.com.au or starward.com in the US. We have these limited releases like the ginger beer casts that come out, and we reward loyalty. Like, so they're typically available first, if not exclusively online. Stay in touch that way. I'd love to kind of, I'm becoming increasingly more a founder and less like an operator of the business. So if you see me out and about, please say hi, and I'd love to share a drink with you.
Awesome, man. And you want to put your personal cell number up as well for people? I'm only teasing. I'm only teasing. Dave, all joking aside, you've been a fountain of knowledge, a champion of Australian whiskies and the category. Thank you for all you're doing. It's real. Like I said, personally, I find this really inspiring. I found our chat in Chicago really inspiring as well. So thanks for being a guest on Not Another Whiskey Podcast. I'll sign off. Mitch, you want anything to say to our fabulous following before we go?
No, thanks everyone for listening. And Dave, thanks for being on the show, man. It's been great chatting with you. Thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure, Mitch. Thanks, Nicholas.
Cheers, brother.